Today I'm talking with Craig A. Hart, and let me tell you a little bit about Craig, but first let me say hi. Hi, Craig. How you doing?
All right, Jim. Good. Glad to be here.
All right. This is what is written on Craig's Amazon page, so I will assume it is true. Craig A. Hart is the stay-at-home
It's a
father
dangerous
of...
assumption.
You can correct me if I'm wrong when I'm done here. Craig A. Hart is the stay-at-home father of twin boys, his most important job. Secondly, he's the author of the Shelby Alexander thriller series and the Spyco novella series. A native of Grand Rapids, Michigan, Craig lives in Iowa City, Iowa. And that's it. That's pretty short and to the point on your Amazon bio there.
Yeah, much like my books, they tend to run. They tend to run short.
I do too. I have a hard time writing long. My longest book
Yeah.
is about 85,000 words, and that was hard to get it up to that length.
I have dreams of one day writing this massive epic. Like I've always had that, thing that you need a forklift to move around. I don't know if I'm ever going to get there though, unless I put a lot of my stuff together and call each book a chapter.
Sure.
But I tend to write short, and I guess maybe that's a good thing because I know it seems to be a more common occurrence that people write long and have to learn how to cut things down. But I seem to have the opposite problem.
Yeah, I'm that way too.
For better or worse.
Exactly, I'm that way too. I write short in first draft, and then I go back and I expand it to like twice as long as it was.
Right.
Anyway, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and about what you write?
Well, I write mostly thrillers. Started out writing more, I guess you would call it literary fiction. My first published novel, I would say, was Becoming Moon, which is literary fiction. And I discovered that it's very difficult to market and sell literary fiction unless you're an established name, like John Irving, for example, or somebody like that. And I was not them. So I began to do a little market research, and one of the things that I had always enjoyed reading was thriller, suspense, that kind of thing. And so I said, well, why don't I try that? That's something I like to read, and I always say to write the books that you want to read. So I gave that a shot, and turned out that not only did I enjoy doing it, but other people seemed to enjoy reading it. So I kept going with that.
Yeah, it seems like to get noticed in literary fiction, you really have to go the short story route first. You have to get what is it, the push cart? Is that that's the big prize?
That's one of them. Yeah.
Get a New Yorker. You have to build up your short story credentials, and then you get attention when your book comes out.
Right, and the thing is that people who do well at literary fiction tend to go the traditional publishing route, and I didn't want to do that. Like I don't know if I'm too impatient. Like I didn't want to jump all the hoops, find an agent and do the submissions and wait for years. And I just didn't want to. And then again, the short story takes time to build up a short story repertoire and a list of credits to actually have people take you seriously. And like, you know what, I'm not sure I want to do that. I want to do things now. I've always been that type, for better or worse, that I don't let the grass grow underneath my feet. I like to keep moving, and the literary fiction route just looked like too long of a haul for me.
Yep, absolutely. I get that. I was the exact same way with my writing career. So today we're going to talk about your favorite thriller. And when you first told me your choice, I thought it was a little curious because this is not a writer who's known for thrillers.
Right.
But why don't you tell us about the book you chose?
Sure. So one of my favorite thrillers is called Last of the Breed, and it's by Louis L'Amour. So you're right. Louis L'Amour is not known for writing thrillers. He's mostly known as the Western guy. But there was a time, and I still am a big fan of his, but there was a time when I read everything I could get by him. But I discovered that the books by him that I liked the most were not his Westerns. They were the novels, the historical novels, like The Walking Drum is a really good one. Haunted Mesa is another non-Western, more modern, set in the West, but it's in modern day. And then, of course, Last of the Breed. And Last of the Breed is it's set in the Cold War, and so it features this pilot, Joe Mack, who is a Native American, a Sioux, and he's flying an experimental plane over Soviet airspace, and he's shot down and captured. So that's the setup to the book. But the meat of the story is that he escapes and uses his knowledge, his Native American knowledge and heritage that he gleaned to trek all the way across Siberia to freedom. We assume the book ends up on a bit of a question mark, but we can assume that he did get away. It's just the premise has been done before, but Lamore handled it so well. And when I first read it, I was shocked because it was so different from his Western stuff. And a lot of people don't give him credit for being the master craftsman that he really was. I think at times he perhaps felt trapped in that Western genre, because I've read a lot of things where he would write things to try to get out of it, and people and his publishers, for example, would say, no, we don't want that from you, we want the Westerns because that's what's selling. But he had dreams and ambitions beyond that, and he had the chops to do it, and I think that book is a prime example of it.
Interesting. Yeah, I always think of Shel Silverstein, so known for his children's poetry, but he wrote some pretty excellent poetry for grown-ups that really never got didn't get a whole lot of attention because of what he was known for.
Yeah, he wrote some stuff for Playboy.
So I don't know anything about this book. I haven't read the Last Breed. Would you say that it's more like a plot-driven book, or is it more driven by this Joe Mack character? Is it more a character study?
It starts out plot-based. Like, you get the feeling that it might be a thriller, but once you get into it, it is a thriller, but it also has a lot of elements of suspense to it. And by that I say some of the more traditional thrillers that we think of, they tend to be plot-based, fast-moving action, but this one has a lot of character in it as well. And it's partly Joe Mack, but I would say the biggest character in the book is the elements and the terrain and the land. That's the elephant in the room. That's what he's battling against, and everything he does is controlled and dictated by those elements. And so, again, that's to me a testament to Lamore's skill, that he was able to take a non-human element of the book and make it the most important character in the book.
So is the element or the elements, is that the villain of the book, or is there a regular villain you could tell us about without spoiling everything? I wouldn't. The elements, they're not an evil thing. They're just something that is there. It's but it's amoral. There is a villain in the book, and it is a kind of his Joe Mack's Russian counterpart. So a native who has learned and lived off the land, and so the book pits these two characters who, in most ways, are equal. In fact, the Soviet guy has a bit of an edge because he's more familiar with that area than Joe Mack is. And so you can see the chapters kind of go back and forth between, you see the Soviet and Alekin, that's his name. Alekin, he's trying to track down Joe through the wilderness, and then Joe taking measures to escape that. So it's kind of this chess match that's played out throughout the book. It seems like in most thrillers, in the really good ones, you have the protagonist and the antagonist who are at least equally matched, and usually in a good one, the antagonist is more powerful, and that adds a lot to the tension of how is the hero going to win going up against a stronger force.
Right. I think that is, you hit the nail on that, is absolutely key for pretty much any book. Especially thrillers, because the stakes have to be high enough to make the reader care at all. And I think that was one of the things, that's something I think that has improved most about my own writing. Like, I didn't get that early on. I tended to spend all my time focused on the main character and building them up and fleshing them out, and then throw in the villain kind of as an afterthought. Okay, I need somebody for him to fight. But that doesn't work. You have to spend as much or perhaps more time working on your bad guy as you do your hero. And if you can make the bad guy as human as your hero, you're going to have a hell of a story.
Everybody knows Darth Vader is way cooler than Luke Skywalker.
Right. Yeah. I mean, go back to your point where perhaps the villain has to be stronger. When you have a main character who is all powerful, that's super boring. Nobody's going to want to read that. That was the problem. That's why they invented kryptonite for Superman, because they started out, you're like, there's this guy is invincible. There's nothing he can do. So they had to invent some element or something that could actually render him helpless in some way.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why I haven't really gelled with the Jack Reacher books, because he's so capable. He doesn't really have flaws.
Right.
He can beat up anybody. He can solve any puzzle. He can figure out any. It's really hard to put one over on him. So it doesn't really. I don't know. I've read a few Jack Reacher books and I actually liked some of them, but other ones I didn't, because it just didn't feel like they're like I knew Jack Reacher was going to make it through just fine because you put him in a bar and he's playing pool and there's 12 guys there who want to beat him up. I'm like, I know Jack can handle this. There's really there's no question
12.
that he's going to kick all 12 of their butts and and before his song in the jukebox is finished, he's going to kick all 12 of their butts.
Right.
Anyway, back to Louis L'Amour. So would you describe this book as a page turner, and what does that mean to you?
It certainly was for me. And I guess, I don't know, I guess it's what it sounds like, something that continues to force you to turn those pages. And it's sometimes a mystery what that element is in a book. And it means different things to different people. For example, there are people who love, say, I was talking with Hallie Efron. She writes suspense and has won some awards for it and whatnot. And we were talking about suspense. And she said it takes a certain kind of reader to read suspense. And I think that's true of any genre. So what is a page turner for one person may not necessarily be a page turner to another. But for me, the technique, if a writer can bring a reader from one sentence to the next, and from one paragraph to the next, one page to the next, and then chapter to the next, you can make a page turner out of pretty much any genre if you have nailed that technique down. And they are kind of specific to each genre, but there are some common elements that pull that together. And that's, I mean, we could talk for a week about what that entails, plot, characterization, and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, page turner is kind of it's a word that kind of gets tacked onto thrillers. You see it in summaries all the time. A page turner, and I think that applies. But I think it can also apply to pretty much any genre that's out there if it's done properly.
Mm-hmm. So when she said there's a certain kind of reader who you have to be a certain kind of reader to read suspense, who do you think suspense is not good for?
Well, she gave the example of, well, herself, which was interesting because she writes them, but she saying that for example, if we're watching television and the show is too suspenseful, you just have to turn it off. I can't take it anymore. And I could understand that because my wife does that all the time. Like I'm watching a show or something, gotta turn off. And we're like, why? This is the good part. Why would you turn it? She's like, I can't take it. I cannot handle it. Okay. And I think there's a certain reader who that they don't like that tension. Mm-hmm. Like it's a lot of times it's the same people who don't like confrontation, like they can't handle that element for some reason, and I don't thrive on it, but in a story, that's what makes a story work is confrontation and disagreements and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it was just a really interesting, I hadn't ever thought about it that way before talking with Hallie Efron, and but I think in large part she's right about that.
I don't mind at all cliffhangers and tension in a book or a TV show like that. But what I can't stand is that kind of cringy uncomfortableness that you get on Curb Your Enthusiasm or The Office. That because you just know that Michael Scott or Larry is going to say something horrible and everything's going to go so wrong. That really puts me on edge. So I guess I can kind of relate to that.
Yeah.
Is this book a series?
No, it is not, and I don't think it would necessarily work as one. I suppose you could rework it a bit and make it work into a series of TV shows, but in terms of a series of books, it's pretty satisfying and tidy the way it is. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things that does work well as a standalone.
Did Louis L'Amour write miniseries?
He has, yeah, well, sort of. He has the Sacketts, it's kind of a series. So what is the Sacketts? It's a family name. And what he does with each book is he takes a different generation of Sacketts and then follows them throughout the years.
Hmm.
So we get to see back in the 1500s all the way up to the Old West, for example. And then of course he has the whole family tree laid out, and you can
Hmm.
follow these people. So that's kind of a series, but it's not the kind of series where you would have to necessarily read them in order to understand the characters per se,
Hmm.
because they're divided by time and generations.
It's kind of like the way most romance series is that each one, usually follows a different set of characters because you can't have the same characters breaking up and getting back together over and over again
Right.
over 12 books. That wouldn't really work. People get pretty tired. Just get together, God.
Right.
Uh, so, what's the one thing that makes this book stand above other thrillers that you enjoy? What is it that made you choose this book?
It played an important role for, I think, influencing me to become a writer. I read it for the first time pretty early on. I don't know how old I was, but I was probably 11 or 12. And again, it was just so different from what Louis L'Amour had, my exposure to Louis L'Amour at that point, that it really stood out. Not only because it was different, but because it was just so different from what he did, and it was so good. And I think I read it at the right time. Like I was starting to kind of get interested in words and how they work together. And then I read this book, and it was just sort of a slap across the face, like, oh wow, this was amazing.
Hmm.
So it just, I don't know exactly why it had that effect on me beyond what I've already laid out, but it really did. It really was like a light bulb turned on. So it's really stayed with me, for those reasons. It's just it's a standout book.
Have you read a lot of his other stuff, or do you stay away from his westerns and just read his thrillery adventure kind of stuff?
I've read a lot of his stuff. I don't read the westerns much anymore because it's not really my genre anymore. It used to be when I was a kid. I was very interested in, the opening up of the West and all that stuff, and I still have some interest in it. But now the stuff that I read of his are some of his short stories, which some of those are westerns, but many of them are not. He has a lot of good crime stories. Short stories, and then the few novels I mentioned, like Haunted Mesa, Walking Drum, and Last of the Breed, and a couple of others.
It's pretty, excuse me, it's pretty uncommon. It seems like, at least in the circles you and I run in, for an established author to write in different genres like that, because generally, you become known for a thing and you write in that thing, just like Shel Silverstein, like we were talking about. But like Stephen King is a great example that he primarily writes horror or dark fantasy, but his non-horror stuff is my favorite stuff of his that he's written.
Right.
And when he puts out something that's non-horror, I'm definitely going to read that. Like Joyland came out a few years ago, which was
a
coming of age book about a kid working at a carnival, and it was a great book. And it wasn't it was more kind of one of his books that there's sort of implied supernatural stuff going on, but it wasn't really at the forefront anywhere in the story. So I just think it's interesting when a writer can branch out and work across multiple genres that I don't think you see. I guess I should say you don't see somebody having success with that usually.
Right. Yeah. And of course, now Stephen King he can.
He can write whatever he wants, and it's going to be a New York Times bestseller.
Right, exactly. But there are other examples of it, of course. And then John Grisham is one. He started with the legal thriller stuff, and then he started writing literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it was just like he waited until he could afford to do that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, speaking of genre, what do you think is that makes a thriller a thriller?
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's I mean, there's the technical stuff where you've got it's typically plot driven. It's a lot of action involved, fast moving, and a lot of the things that I think of with thrillers before I got into it weren't necessarily complementary. Like before I had a lot of experience with it. Well, the characters are throwaway characters, cardboard characters. It's all about plot and action and whatnot. And there are certainly some like that. But when I started doing the research and started writing my own and then meeting other thriller authors, I realized that that's really not what it's about at all. Um, to me, a thriller is about creating a character so good that when bad things happen, the stakes are really, really high. And that definition can apply to books that may not technically be called a thriller.
Hmm.
I mean, there's a limit to that, of course, but thrillers just. I don't think you can have a thriller that in which nothing happens. Of course, there has to be some plot movement in there, but I think it's a little overblown in a way, and I certainly had it wrong when I thought about that's all it was, because there's a lot more to it than that.
Interesting. Okay, so we are almost at the conclusion of our little talk. So, what book of yours do you want to tell the audience about? What do you want to promote today, Craig?
Well, let's see. I think I'll say save yourself the trouble. No. One of my more recent ones is Night at Key West, and it's the beginning of a new series. It is a historical mystery set in 1930s Key West, and that's during the time when Ernest Hemingway was living down there. And so the book features him prominently as a character. I think and I forgot to mention this early on, I was going to bring this up. One of my intentions early on when I started getting into thriller away from literary fiction was to find a way to marry the two genres together. I thought, well, why can't you have a thriller and a thriller / mystery? Because the boundary there is kind of blurry for me. And then marry that with some aspects of literary fiction. And by that, I was thinking of characterization. I've come to learn that the two, there aren't necessarily as separate as I thought they were originally. But anyway, when I first started writing thrillers, that's what I wanted to do, was to bring the two together and take the best elements of both and create something different. A first series I tried with the Shelby Alexander series, it wasn't as the series has done well, but in terms of what I wanted to do, it wasn't as successful as I wanted it to be. The Simon Wolf series, of which Night at Key West is the first installment, is my second attempt to do that, and I think a more successful one as well, where I bring in some elements, that I learned from literary fiction and brought it into the thriller realm in a way. So I use there's a lot of characterization, but I also use the setting as a big part of the character, the Key West setting. Like, I did a lot of research about it, and I've had people who have been there and lived there who've read it and told me that you nailed it. So I use the setting and I use the weather, all that as effect on the story itself.
I believe there's a term for that that crossover between literary and genre fiction. I think they call that upmarket. I think that's, I may be totally remembering that wrong, but that's what I remember them describing as genre fiction, where the focus is more on the quality of the prose than it is on the plot. But who knows? It's been a while since I heard that, so I don't even know if people call it that anymore.
Well, heaven forbid with the terms wrong these days.
Yeah, I know. Who knows? I'm just saying words here. Anyway. Well, I really appreciate you stopping by, Craig, to talk about Louis L'Amour's book and talking about your own book, Night at Key West. And thanks for coming by, and I hope you have a great day, man.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jim. I had a good fun.
Take care.